February 15th, 1944, POW Camp 121, North Burma. The metal scalpel felt unnaturally cold beneath Shigeru Sugiura's fingers as he steadied his hand above the distended abdomen of the British soldier. The makeshift operating table, a wooden door balanced atop two sawhorses, creaked as the prisoner shifted in agony. 6 miles from the front lines where Allied forces hammered Japanese positions, Dr. Sugiura prepared to save an enemy's life. The bamboo field hospital offered little protection from the elements. Monsoon rains leaked through the thatched roof, falling in steady drops that collected in rusted tins strategically placed to prevent the dirt floor from becoming mud. The smell permeated everything: gangrene, dysentery, malnutrition, and the peculiar metallic odor of suppurating tropical ulcers. A single kerosene lamp provided what light there was, casting long shadows across the prisoner's gaunt face. "His appendix will rupture within the hour," Sugiura explained in careful English to the skeptical British medical officer observing from 3 feet away. "Without surgery, death is certain." Captain James Hartley, the senior Allied medical officer in Camp 121, checked the patient's pulse again. "And with surgery, Lieutenant Barrow's chances?" "Perhaps 50%, Sugiura answered honestly. "The infection has spread. Equipment is—" He gestured at the pitiful collection of instruments arranged on a cloth beside him. A scalpel, fishing line repurposed as sutures, tweezers fashioned from scrap metal, and cotton bandages boiled in what little clean water remained. The distant thunder of artillery punctuated their conversation. The Allied bombing campaign had intensified over the past week, advancing closer to the camp each day. The irony wasn't lost on Sugiura. He was fighting to save a British soldier while British bombs fell near enough to rattle the surgical instruments. Lieutenant Barrow moaned, his temperature climbing past 104 degrees. The decision could wait no longer. "Begin," Captain Hartley ordered, stepping back to give Sugiura room to work. The incision was clean, despite everything, a testament to hands that had performed over 2,000 surgeries in Tokyo's most prestigious hospital before war conscription had transformed an esteemed surgeon into a reluctant military doctor. Blood welled immediately, darker than it should be. Signs of advanced infection. Sugiura worked with mechanical precision, his movements economical in the confined space. The appendix appeared exactly as feared, grossly swollen, purplish black, moments from rupture. He clamped, cut, tied off with a decisive efficiency that belied the primitive conditions. The procedure took exactly 9 minutes. "It is done," he said, stepping back as Captain Hartley moved forward to inspect his work. "The next 6 hours will determine if he lives." Outside, the bombing had stopped, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the moans of the 68 other patients crowded into the 20 by 40-foot space. Nearly half suffered from the tropical ulcers that would soon become Sugiura's obsession, necrotic wounds that devoured flesh with horrifying speed, turning limbs gangrenous within days. Captain Hartley's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Where did you train, Doctor?" "Tokyo Imperial University Medical School. Then 2 years in London before the war." The admission hung between them, an acknowledgement of a shared profession now divided by conflict. Before Hartley could respond, the bamboo doors swung open as 2 British orderlies carried in another patient, this one with a massive ulcer consuming his left calf, the tissue blackened and liquefying despite previous treatments. "Another one," Hartley muttered. "Third today. Nothing stops these damned ulcers." Sugiura moved to examine the wound, his mind already turning over possibilities. The standard treatments, debridement, sulfanilamide powder, bandaging, had proven woefully inadequate against these tropical infections. The mortality rate approached 80% once the necrosis reached a certain stage. "I have seen similar cases in Singapore," Sugiura offered cautiously. "There may be another approach." Hartley looked up sharply. "What approach?" But before Sugiura could elaborate, Lieutenant Barrow suddenly convulsed on the operating table, his body arching in a violent seizure. Both doctors rushed back, working in temporary alliance to stabilize the patient. 3 hours later, Barrow's fever broke. He would survive, the first of what would eventually be thousands saved through Sugiura's interventions. But as the surgeon washed blood from his hands in a dented aluminum basin, he knew the greater challenge still lay ahead. The tropical ulcers represented a medical crisis unlike anything in his experience, requiring a solution beyond conventional wisdom. That night, while other prisoners slept, Sugiura sketched surgical techniques in the margins of an old medical journal, developing the procedure that would eventually save over 10,000 lives. His captors had taken his freedom, his dignity, even his identity as anything but an enemy. But they couldn't take his training or his physician's compulsion to heal, even those who wore different uniforms. "Sugiura-sensei," whispered a voice from the darkness. A Japanese guard, the only one who still addressed him with honorifics, stood at the edge of his workspace. "Air raid coming. You should take shelter." Sugiura nodded but didn't move, continuing his careful sketches as distant planes droned closer. In the morning, 3 more ulcer cases arrived. Captain Hartley, eyes hollow from sleeplessness, approached Sugiura again. "You mentioned another approach to these ulcers," he said without preamble. "I'm listening now." The moment represented a turning point, medicine transcending battle lines. What began that morning would evolve into a revolutionary surgical technique born of desperation and genius, spreading through POW camps across Burma, and eventually saving thousands who would have otherwise perished from what Allied soldiers had grimly christened the death rot. But on that February morning, with rain drumming on bamboo and the war pressing in from all sides, it was simply 2 doctors confronting suffering with the inadequate tools at hand. July 23, 1908. Kanazawa, Ishikawa Prefecture, Japan. The cherry blossoms fell like pink snow around 6-year-old Shigeru Sugiura as he knelt beside his grandfather in the family garden. The old man's fingers, gnarled from decades of practicing traditional medicine, guided the boy's smaller hands as they ground herbs in a stone mortar. "Medicine is not just science, Shigeru-kun," his grandfather said softly. "It is an art passed from one generation to another, like the flow of a river." The boy nodded solemnly, but his eyes drifted to the modern doctor's bag his father had brought home from the new hospital in Kanazawa. Its gleaming instruments and glass vials of Western medicine represented a different world than his grandfather's herbs and acupuncture needles. This tension between traditional Japanese medicine and Western approaches would define Sugiura's life long before he found himself in a Burmese prison camp. Born to a family that had practiced traditional medicine for 7 generations, Shigeru represented a turning point, the first Sugiura to embrace Western medical science. At Tokyo Imperial University in 1926, Sugiura distinguished himself immediately. While other students struggled with anatomy, Shigeru demonstrated an almost preternatural understanding of the human body, combining his grandfather's teachings about interconnected systems with Western precision. "Your incisions are like calligraphy, Sugiura-san," Professor Tanaka observed during a dissection practicum. "Precise yet flowing." By his 3rd year, Sugiura had published research on vascular surgical techniques that caught the attention of British doctors visiting the university. This led to an unprecedented opportunity, a 2-year fellowship at London Hospital under Sir Henry Soutar, one of Europe's pioneering vascular surgeons. In London, between 1932 and 1934, Sugiura absorbed Western surgical innovations while occasionally startling his British colleagues with techniques influenced by Eastern medicine. He developed a particular interest in tissue regeneration, studying how the body healed itself after trauma, knowledge that would later prove crucial in Burma. "You think differently, Sugiura," Soutar told him during a complex arterial repair. "You see connections where others see only separate parts." Returning to Japan in 1934, Sugiura found a country increasingly militarized. As he established himself at Tokyo's Keio University Hospital, political pressure grew. His publications on efficient field surgery techniques, intended for civilian disaster response, caught military attention. The conscription notice arrived in spring 1941. Despite his international reputation, Sugiura could not avoid military service as Japan prepared for wider conflict. He was commissioned as a captain in the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps, given 1 week to settle his affairs. The night before reporting for duty, Sugiura sat alone in his garden, burning his correspondence with British and American colleagues. His wife, Akiko, watched silently from the doorway, 7 months pregnant with a child he might never see. "I will heal, not harm," he told her, repeating the physician's oath he had taken, even in war. Those words would be tested severely in the coming years. Initially stationed in Singapore, Sugiura served at a large military hospital where his surgical innovations saved hundreds of Japanese soldiers. But as imperial forces pushed into Burma in early 1943, he was transferred closer to the front lines. The brutality he witnessed there shook his faith in humanity. Japanese military policy toward prisoners violated every principle of medical ethics he held sacred. When ordered to prioritize Japanese wounded and leave Allied prisoners to die, Sugiura began small acts of resistance, smuggling medications to the prisoner areas, treating serious cases under the guise of interrogation preparation. On December 7, 1943, during a massive Allied air raid on Japanese positions near the Burmese-Indian border, Sugiura's field hospital took a direct hit. 19 Japanese medical personnel died instantly. Sugiura, searching for survivors in the wreckage, encountered an advance patrol of Gurkha soldiers serving with British forces. "Surrender or die," their lieutenant commanded in broken Japanese. Sugiura raised his hands, still covered in the blood of soldiers he had tried to save. "I am a doctor," he replied in English. The British initially treated him with the suspicion reserved for all Japanese prisoners. But during his processing at a forward operating base, fate intervened. A British medical officer suffered an acute abdominal emergency, suspected appendicitis with complications. The nearest qualified surgeon was 8 hours away. "The prisoner claims to be a surgeon," someone mentioned. "Trained in London, apparently." Desperate circumstances forced a critical decision. Sugiura was brought to the stricken officer, his hands still bound. "If I remove these," the commanding officer said, indicating the restraints, "and you attempt anything, you will be shot immediately. Do you understand?" Sugiura nodded once. When the restraints came off, he requested water to wash his hands, then asked to examine the patient. His diagnosis was immediate and precise. Not appendicitis, but a perforated duodenal ulcer requiring immediate intervention. For the next 3 hours, using unfamiliar equipment in a field hospital tent, Sugiura performed a flawless emergency procedure. The British medical staff watched with increasing amazement as his hands moved with extraordinary precision, employing techniques some had only read about in recent medical journals. The British officer survived. Within 48 hours, rather than being processed through normal POW channels, Sugiura was transferred to Camp 121, a decision that would ultimately save thousands of lives. As he was escorted into the camp that would become his home for the duration of the war, Captain Hartley sized him up with a mixture of professional curiosity and wartime suspicion. "They say you studied with Sutar himself," Hartley said finally. "Yes," Sugiura replied, "and now I am here." "Well," Hartley said, gesturing toward the overcrowded bamboo hospital where men lay dying from wounds, disease, and the mysterious tropical ulcers, "we need every doctor we can get, even enemy ones." March 7, 1944, POW Camp 121, North Burma. The smell hit you first. Walking into the isolation ward, Captain Hartley pressed a cloth soaked in diluted carbolic acid against his nose. Even that couldn't fully mask the stench of rotting flesh. 23 men lay on bamboo pallets, each suffering from tropical ulcers at various stages. The worst cases made hardened medical staff turn away. "3 more died in the night," said the Australian nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie, her face haggard from lack of sleep. "Jenkins lasted longer than we expected, almost 5 days after the ulcer reached his knee." Hartley nodded grimly. What had begun as a troubling medical condition had exploded into a full-blown crisis. In the past month alone, 42 prisoners had died from complications related to tropical ulcers. The pattern was always the same. A small scratch or insect bite on the leg would quickly become infected in the hot, humid conditions. Within days, the infection would form a crater-like wound that grew alarmingly fast, consuming healthy tissue as it spread. Traditional treatments had proven nearly useless. They had tried everything in their limited medical arsenal: aggressive debridement, cutting away dead tissue until reaching healthy bleeding flesh, sulfanilamide powder sprinkled directly into wounds, hot compresses, even the old standby of maggot therapy to clean necrotic tissue. Nothing stopped the inexorable spread once an ulcer reached a certain stage. "The men are calling it the Devourer," Mackenzie said quietly. "They're more afraid of it than Japanese bullets." At the far end of the ward, Dr. Sugiura knelt beside a young Welsh soldier whose right calf displayed a textbook case, a 6-inch diameter crater of blackened, liquefying flesh surrounded by angry red inflammation. The Japanese doctor had been observing the ulcer cases intensely since his arrival, spending hours examining wounds, taking careful notes, even scraping samples to study under the camp's one battered microscope. Hartley approached, watching as Sugiura gently probed the edges of the wound. "Any insights, doctor?" he asked, professional curiosity temporarily overriding his natural wariness of the enemy physician. Sugiura sat back on his heels, choosing his words carefully. His English, though excellent, still required concentration. "I believe we misunderstand the nature of these ulcers," he said. "We treat them as normal infections, but they behave differently." He pointed to the distinct pattern visible in the wound. The way the infection created almost perfect circles of destruction as it spread outward. "Look at the vascular pattern. The infection travels along blood vessels, destroying them as it goes. This is why the wounds do not heal. No blood can reach the damaged tissue." Hartley frowned, seeing the patterns Sugiura indicated. "So what do you propose?" "A different approach to surgery," Sugiura replied. "Not just removing dead tissue, but restructuring blood flow." He explained his theory. The tropical bacteria responsible for the ulcers produced toxins that specifically attacked blood vessels. The standard debridement technique couldn't keep pace with the infection's spread because it didn't address the vascular destruction. Sugiura proposed a radical solution, a combination of techniques he had studied in Japan and London, adapted for their desperate circumstances. "We must remove all infected tissue, yes, but then create new pathways for blood to reach healing areas," Sugiura explained, sketching quickly on a scrap of paper. "Using skin flaps rotated from healthy areas, bringing their blood supply with them." The technique he outlined was unorthodox, combining elements of plastic surgery with vascular repair, all adapted to be performed with their limited equipment. It required precise tissue handling and a deep understanding of blood supply patterns, skills Sugiura had mastered in his previous life. Hartley studied the Japanese doctor's face, looking for any hint of deception. Was this some elaborate ruse, a medical experiment on Allied prisoners? But the desperation of their situation left few alternatives. "Who would you operate on first?" Hartley asked. "Him," Sugiura said without hesitation, indicating a Scottish sergeant whose ulcer had resisted all previous treatments but hadn't yet reached the point of no return. "His infection is advanced enough to test the procedure, but not so far that success is impossible." "And your success rate?" Hartley pressed. Sugiura met his gaze directly. "Unknown. This exact procedure has never been performed, but without intervention, his death is certain within the week." The ethical dilemma hung between them. Standard medical protocols prohibited experimental procedures without extensive review, patient consent forms, and oversight committees. But they were in a POW camp in the Burmese jungle, losing men daily to a condition that defied conventional treatment. That afternoon, the senior Allied officers met in what had once been the camp commandant's office. The debate was heated. "He's the enemy," argued Major Williams, still recovering from wounds received at Singapore. "How do we know this isn't some twisted experiment?" "We're losing 5 men a week to these ulcers," countered Hartley. "At this rate, half the camp will be dead by monsoon season." After 3 hours, they reached a decision. Sergeant McPherson, the Scottish soldier Sugiura had identified, was briefed on the experimental procedure and given the choice. "I've watched mates die from these bloody ulcers for months," McPherson said simply. "I'll take any chance over none." The next morning, in a corner of the bamboo hospital, partitioned off with sheets boiled in the precious little clean water they had, Sugiura prepared for surgery. The tools laid out before him would have horrified his colleagues in Tokyo. Scalpels fashioned from razor blades, sutures made from unraveled parachute cords sterilized in alcohol, retractors bent from mess kit spoons. Hartley would assist, both to learn the technique and to ensure nothing untoward occurred. As they washed their hands in the last of the surgical spirit, Hartley asked the question that had troubled him since Sugiura's arrival. "Why help us? We're your enemy." Sugiura's hands never paused in their methodical scrubbing. "Illness recognizes no uniform," he replied. "Neither should medicine." Outside the makeshift operating room, the other prisoners waited for word of success or failure. What happened next would determine the fate of thousands. March 8, 1944. POW Camp 121, North Burma. The first incision was perfect, a clean, decisive cut that traced the outer margin of Sergeant McPherson's ulcer with mathematical precision. Blood welled immediately, darker than it should be but still flowing, a hopeful sign that viable tissue remained nearby. Sugiura worked with focused intensity, his movements economical in the confined space. Captain Hartley stood opposite, assisting and observing with the keen attention of a man watching for both medical innovation and potential treachery. "The conventional approach," Sugiura explained as he worked, "removes dead tissue until reaching healthy bleeding tissue. This is correct, but insufficient." The surgeon's hands never stopped moving as he spoke, methodically excising the necrotic flesh in concentric circles, working inward rather than outward, as was standard practice. With each layer removed, he inspected the exposed blood vessels, occasionally pausing to make notations on a scrap paper that Hartley would update for him. "Notice the pattern of vascular destruction," Sugiura continued, pointing with the tip of his scalpel to the collapsed veins visible in the tissue. "The infection travels inward along blood vessels, destroying them. We must not only remove dead tissue but create new pathways for blood to reach healing areas." 3 hours into the procedure, the radical nature of Sugiura's approach became apparent. Having completely debrided the infected area, a crater nearly 4 inches deep and 8 inches across, he began the unprecedented next phase. Using modified surgical techniques he had developed in Tokyo, Sugiura carefully identified the nearest healthy blood vessels in the surrounding tissue. "Now we mobilize adjacent healthy tissue with its blood supply intact," he explained, demonstrating a cutting technique that preserved the delicate vascular connections. "This tissue, what Western medicine calls a flap, will be rotated to cover the defect, bringing its blood supply with it. With improvised instruments that would have horrified a properly equipped operating theatre, retractors made from bent spoons, hemostats fashioned from modified pliers, Sugiura executed complex tissue rearrangements that Hartley had only read about in advanced surgical texts. "Remarkable," Hartley murmured, as he watched the Japanese surgeon rotate a meticulously preserved flap of healthy tissue into the wound bed, its blood supply intact. "This is plastic surgery technique, combined with vascular principles," Sugiura corrected. "The flap brings new blood vessels to fight infection and support healing." The final phase involved a technique that made even Hartley uncomfortable. Sugiura harvested thin strips of skin from McPherson's thigh, shaving them with a modified razor to specific depth. These he placed as grafts over areas where the flaps couldn't reach, creating a patchwork of new skin over the former ulcer site. "The grafts will take root if blood supply reaches them," Sugiura explained. "Without our vascular flap rotation, they would fail." 7 hours after the first incision, Sugiura placed the final suture. The procedure had consumed nearly all the camp's remaining surgical supplies, suture material, dressings, and the precious little anesthetic they had hoarded. McPherson remained unconscious, his breathing steady, his fate now hanging in the balance between innovative genius and reckless experimentation. "Now we wait," Sugiura said simply, washing blood from his hands in a dented basin. The waiting proved excruciating. For 3 days, McPherson drifted between consciousness and fever dreams, while the medical staff watched for signs of renewed infection. Standard tropical ulcers typically resumed their destructive spread within 72 hours after conventional surgery, the temporary respite of debridement inevitably giving way to continued necrosis. On the 4th morning, Hartley and Sugiura carefully removed the outer dressings. The moment of truth had arrived. If infection had recurred, McPherson would likely lose his leg, or his life. If not, they had discovered something revolutionary. The wound edges were pink, not angry red or grey-black. The telltale smell of necrosis was absent. Most significantly, the skin grafts showed signs of vascularization, tiny blood vessels beginning to penetrate their surfaces. "It's working," Hartley whispered. Professional reserve momentarily abandoned. McPherson himself confirmed their success in typically understated fashion when he regained full consciousness that afternoon. "Hurts like blazes, but different than before, like healing pain, not rotting pain." News spread through the camp with astonishing speed. By nightfall, a dozen men with progressive ulcers had requested the Sugiura procedure, as Hartley had dubbed it in his meticulous medical notes. The Japanese surgeon found himself transformed overnight from suspicious enemy to potential savior. The camp's senior Allied officer, Colonel Davidson, summoned both doctors to his quarters, a slightly less squalid corner of the same bamboo building that housed the hospital ward. "Explain to me exactly what happened in there," he demanded. "In terms even I can understand." Sugiura allowed Hartley to explain, the British doctor now an enthusiastic advocate for the technique he'd witnessed. "It's a completely novel approach, sir," Hartley concluded. "He's essentially created a surgical technique that provides new blood supply to areas where vessels have been destroyed by the infection." Davidson considered this, then asked the critical question, "Can you teach this to other doctors?" Sugiura nodded. "With proper instruction, yes. The principles are not complex, though the execution requires practice." The decision was made. Over the next 3 days, as McPherson's recovery continued without complication, Sugiura conducted impromptu teaching sessions for the camp's 6 Allied medical officers. Using drawings on scavenged paper and demonstrations on cadavers of those who had succumbed to other causes, he methodically transferred his knowledge. The first independent procedure performed by Hartley under Sugiura's supervision succeeded. So did the second, performed by an Australian medical officer. By the end of March, the 5 most severe cases had undergone the procedure, with all showing signs of recovery rather than the inevitable decline they had witnessed for months. Word of the medical breakthrough spread to other camps through prisoner transfers and the irregular communications network maintained by Allied intelligence. Detailed instructions for the Sugiura procedure were transcribed in duplicate, with one copy hidden in the camp and another smuggled out with a prisoner deemed too ill to remain in the jungle. At a field hospital 50 miles away, the first non-eyewitness implementation of the technique saved the life of a Gurkha soldier whose leg had been scheduled for amputation. 2 weeks later, an American doctor at a different camp successfully adapted the procedure for a particularly severe case involving the upper arm rather than the typical lower limb presentation. By early April, when Sugiura performed his 20th procedure, the mortality rate for tropical ulcer cases in Camp 121 had dropped from 80% to below 25%. Those who received the treatment within the first week of ulcer development showed nearly 90% recovery rates. "We have something extraordinary here," Hartley told Sugiura one evening as they reviewed patient progress. "Something that will save thousands if we can get the knowledge out." Sugiura nodded, but remained pensive. "Medicine should never have borders," he said quietly. Yet it took a war for this discovery. The sound of distant artillery punctuated his words, a reminder that beyond their medical collaboration, the world remained locked in deadly conflict. Yet inside the bamboo walls of Camp 121, enemy doctors had found common ground in the universal mission of healing. June 15, 1944. Burma-India border region. Word of the Sugiura technique spread through the scattered Allied POW network like wildfire through dry bamboo. 3 months after the first successful procedure, variations of the method were being performed in 7 different camps across Burma and Thailand. The medical underground, a clandestine network of Allied doctors sharing information despite Japanese restrictions, had adopted the procedure as standard protocol for advanced tropical ulcer cases. Colonel Thomas Williams, senior medical officer for Allied Forces Southeast Asia Command, received the smuggled documentation of the technique during an inspection of a recently liberated field hospital near Imphal. The papers, written in Captain Hartley's precise handwriting with detailed anatomical drawings by Sugiura himself, had travelled over 200 miles through Japanese-held territory, passed from one underground operative to another until reaching Allied lines. "This can't possibly be legitimate," Williams muttered, studying the papers. "A Japanese POW developed this." Major Lawrence Patterson, who had witnessed the procedure firsthand after being transferred from Camp 121 to a transit camp closer to the front, nodded emphatically. "I've seen it work, sir. 15 cases that would have certainly resulted in death or amputation. 13 complete recoveries." Williams had spent the past year documenting Japanese medical atrocities throughout occupied territories. The barbaric experiments conducted at certain facilities had hardened his heart against anything associated with Japanese medicine. But the detailed procedure notes before him displayed undeniable surgical brilliance, and the testimonials from trusted Allied medical officers couldn't be ignored. "Get this to General Headquarters immediately," Williams ordered, "and find me anyone who's performed this technique personally." Within 2 weeks, modified versions of the Sugiura procedure were being taught at Allied field hospitals throughout the Burma theatre. The technical documentation, now titled Vascular Rotation Flap Technique for Necrotizing Tropical Infections, carefully omitted its Japanese origin in official communications, though whispered acknowledgements of the POW doctor's method persisted among medical staff. Back at Camp 121, Sugiura remained unaware of how far his innovation had spread. The Japanese doctor continued refining his technique, developing modifications for different wound locations and teaching anyone willing to learn. The boundaries between captive and captor blurred in the medical ward, where Allied and Japanese medical personnel increasingly worked side by side against their common enemy, disease. Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie, the Australian nurse who had witnessed the technique's earliest implementations, maintained meticulous records of each case. By early June, she had documented 117 procedures performed at Camp 121 alone, with a success rate of 81% for cases caught before reaching advanced stages. "It's not just the technique itself that matters," she explained to a newly arrived medical officer. "It's changed how we approach wound care entirely. We intervene earlier, we preserve viable tissue more carefully, we think about blood supply in ways we never did before." As Allied forces pushed deeper into Burma, the war's tide shifted. Japanese supply lines stretched to breaking point, and POW camps received diminishing resources. At Camp 121, medicines ran out completely by mid-June. Even basic items like clean bandages became luxury goods. Yet remarkably, survival rates for tropical ulcer cases continued improving as the surgical techniques evolved to accommodate these limitations. Sugiura adapted once again, developing methods requiring minimal supplies. He taught Allied medical staff how to create natural antiseptics from local plants, techniques he had learned from his grandfather decades earlier. When suture material ran out, he demonstrated traditional Japanese methods using sterilized plant fibers. The cultural exchange had come full circle. Western surgical precision now blended with Eastern traditional knowledge out of desperate necessity. On June 28th, The distant rumble of artillery grew louder than usual. For 3 days, the sounds of battle had been approaching Camp 121 steadily. Japanese guards grew increasingly nervous, some abandoning their posts as the Imperial Army's position collapsed. By nightfall, only a skeleton crew of guards remained. In the pre-dawn hours of June 29th, the camp awakened to the sound of diesel engines and English voices. The 14th Army's advance units had reached them. Liberation had arrived. The scene that greeted the British Liberation Forces defied their expectations. Instead of finding the anticipated horror of a Japanese prison camp, they discovered something unprecedented. Allied and Japanese medical personnel working side by side in a functioning hospital ward. "What the bloody hell is this?" demanded the British captain leading the advance unit, his weapon raised as he encountered Sugiura tending to an Australian patient. "This is Dr. Sugiura," Hartley intervened quickly, stepping between them. "He's saved more Allied lives than I can count." The liberation created an immediate dilemma. Military protocol dictated that all Japanese personnel be processed as prisoners of war and removed from the camp. Yet removing Sugiura would potentially endanger dozens of patients still under his care. Colonel Davidson, still senior Allied officer despite his emaciated condition after months of captivity, made an unprecedented request to the Liberation Force commander. Dr. Sugiura must be permitted to remain as treating physician until all current patients are stabilized. After heated radio communications with headquarters, an exception was granted. Sugiura would remain at Camp 121 under guard, but permitted to continue medical duties until patients could be evacuated to proper military hospitals. For 2 weeks, as the evacuation proceeded in stages, Sugiura worked alongside Allied doctors, documenting his technique in greater detail now that proper medical supplies were available. Each procedure was photographed, each variation recorded, creating a comprehensive surgical manual that would eventually reach military hospitals throughout Southeast Asia. The final group of patients departed on July 12th. As the last ambulance pulled away, Sugiura stood beside Hartley in the empty hospital ward, the bamboo structure already beginning to deteriorate without daily maintenance. "What happens now?" Sugiura asked quietly. Hartley didn't have an answer. The war continued, and despite everything, Sugiura remained an enemy combatant. The British captain, who had been assigned to guard him, approached, orders in hand. "Dr. Sugiura, you're to be transferred to the POW processing center at Rangoon," he stated formally. "From there to India for the duration." Hartley stepped forward. "This man has saved hundreds of Allied lives. He deserves special consideration." The captain's expression remained impassive. "Not my decision, sir, but I've been informed his medical status has been noted in his file." As Sugiura was led away toward the waiting transport truck, Hartley pressed something into his hand, a small notebook filled with patient records, testimony to the lives saved through their unlikely collaboration. "Medicine has no borders," Hartley said, echoing Sugiura's own words from months earlier. The Japanese doctor nodded once, a slight bow of acknowledgement, before climbing into the truck that would take him away from Camp 121 forever. The notebook traveled with him, documentation of a medical breakthrough born from the most unlikely circumstances, a legacy that would eventually save thousands more lives as war gave way to uneasy peace. In military hospitals across Burma, India, and eventually Europe and the Pacific, the modified Sugiura technique continued spreading, crossing battle lines and national boundaries, medicine transcending war itself. August 15, 1975. Tokyo University Hospital, Japan. The cherry blossoms had long since fallen by the time Dr. Kenneth Bartlett arrived in Tokyo, seeking the surgeon whose technique had saved his leg 30 years earlier. The American orthopedic specialist navigated the crowded hospital corridors with a slight limp, the permanent reminder of the tropical ulcer he had contracted as a young medic in Burma. "I'm looking for Dr. Shigeru Sugiura," he explained to the receptionist in carefully rehearsed Japanese. The woman's eyes widened slightly. "Sugiura-sensei. He is with students. Please, wait here." Bartlett settled into a chair in the waiting area, his mind traveling back to 1945. He had been among the last patients treated with the Sugiura technique in Burma before being evacuated to a military hospital in India. The procedure had saved not only his leg, but his medical career. Now, 3 decades later, he had come to thank the man personally and to deliver a message. Across the Pacific, the significance of Sugiura's innovation had finally received formal recognition. The American College of Surgeons had voted unanimously to award Sugiura their highest honor for his contribution to wartime medicine, an unprecedented acknowledgement of work done by a former enemy combatant. A door opened, and a group of medical students emerged, followed by an elderly Japanese man. At 67, Shigeru Sugiura's hands remained remarkably steady, his posture still military straight despite the grey hair and lined face. He had returned to medicine after 3 years in Allied POW camps, rebuilding his career from nothing in a defeated Japan. Recognition flashed in the old surgeon's eyes as he spotted Bartlett. Though they had never met, something in the American stance and the characteristic walking pattern of former tropical ulcer patients was immediately familiar. "Dr. Bartlett," Sugiura said in English, extending his hand. "After all these years." They spoke for hours in Sugiura's modest office, surrounded by medical texts and framed surgical illustrations. The Japanese doctor listened intently as Bartlett described the technique's evolution and impact after the war. "The modified Sugiura procedure has become standard protocol for necrotizing fasciitis in every major trauma center worldwide," Bartlett explained. "Conservative estimates suggest it saved over 10,000 lives since 1945. Sugiura nodded slowly, his expression reflective. 10,000, he repeated softly. "More than I could have imagined in that bamboo hospital." The official count from military records documented 2,718 cases in the Burma India theatre alone between 1944 and 1945. After the war, the technique spread through international medical journals, initially published without crediting its Japanese origin. By the mid-1950s, modified versions of the procedure were being taught in medical schools throughout Europe and North America, saving countless civilian lives from similar necrotizing infections. "We owe you a formal acknowledgement," Bartlett said, producing an envelope bearing the seal of the American College of Surgeons. "The college is establishing the Sugiura Award for Innovation in Battlefield Medicine. The first presentation will take place next spring in Chicago. They very much hope you'll attend." Sugiura accepted the envelope with both hands and a slight bow, his eyes betraying emotion he wouldn't otherwise express. "After the war," he said quietly, "I wondered if anyone remembered where the technique came from. For many years, Western medical journals called it simply the Burma procedure. The erasure of Sugiura's contribution had been deliberate in the immediate post-war years. Military medicine remained segregated by national boundaries, and acknowledging life-saving innovations from former enemy doctors proved politically complicated. Only through the persistent advocacy of surgeons like Captain Hartley, who had published the first honest account of the technique's origin in the British Medical Journal in 1952, had Sugiura's name gradually been restored to the procedure he created. "Captain Hartley," Sugiura asked suddenly. "Did he survive the war?" Bartlett smiled. "More than survived. He's chairman of surgery at Guy's Hospital in London now. He asked me to give you this." From his briefcase, Bartlett produced a small, worn notebook, the original patient records from Camp 121, meticulously preserved for 3 decades. Inside, Hartley had added a handwritten note. "Medicine transcended borders then. May it always do so." That afternoon, Sugiura led Bartlett through Tokyo University Hospital's research wing, where a team of young surgeons were applying the principles first developed in Burma to new frontiers of vascular surgery. The technique that had begun as desperate improvisation in a POW camp had evolved into sophisticated protocols for tissue reconstruction, influencing everything from battlefield trauma care to civilian burn treatment. "The principles remain the same," Sugiura explained. watching a resident perform a complex vascular repair. Preserve blood supply, create new pathways when needed, respect tissue planes. The body wants to heal if we remove obstacles and create proper conditions. Later, over tea in the hospital garden, Sugiura revealed the personal cost of his medical contributions. Upon repatriation to Japan in 1947, he had faced suspicion from both sides, viewed as a collaborator by some Japanese colleagues, while still considered a former enemy by occupation authorities. "For 5 years, I could not practice surgery," he said. "I taught anatomy to support my family until a former student became hospital director and offered me a position here." Despite these hardships, Sugiura had continued refining his techniques. In 1953, he published his comprehensive work on tissue reconstruction in Japanese medical journals, and by the 1960s had established one of Asia's premier centers for reconstructive surgery at Tokyo University. "In war, I learned medicine must serve humanity first, nationality second," Sugiura reflected. "This lesson cost much, but perhaps it was necessary." The morning Bartlett departed Tokyo, Sugiura presented him with an elegantly bound manuscript, the complete documentation of his surgical innovations, including techniques never before published in Western literature. "For the next generation," Sugiura said simply. 6 months later, Dr. Shigeru Sugiura stood before the American College of Surgeons in Chicago, receiving a standing ovation from doctors representing 27 nations. The citation accompanying his award acknowledged not only the technical brilliance of his innovation, but the moral courage required to treat enemy wounded in direct violation of his orders. In his brief acceptance speech, delivered in the careful English he had maintained since his London days, Sugiura offered a philosophy that transcended the medical procedure itself. "In medicine, we speak often of saving lives. But in war, I learned something more important, that healing hands must recognize no enemy. The greatest disease we face is not infection, but the idea that some lives matter less than others." In the decades that followed, the principles Sugiura pioneered continued evolving. Modern surgeons using microscopes and advanced instruments to repair delicate vascular structures still employ fundamental concepts first demonstrated with improvised tools in a bamboo hospital. Combat medics in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless other conflicts have applied variations of his technique to save limbs and lives. The official medical count of lives saved through direct application of the Sugiura technique and its derivatives surpassed 10,000 in 1982. The unofficial count, including civilian applications of the principles he established, remains incalculable. Dr. Shigeru Sugiura died peacefully in Tokyo on November 12, 1987, at age 79. His obituary appeared in medical journals worldwide, acknowledging the surgeon whose greatest contribution emerged from captivity, whose healing hands reached across battle lines, and whose legacy continues saving lives long after the conflict that forged it has faded into history. On his desk, the morning he died, lay a single sheet of paper, his final modification to the technique, written in the steady hand that had once operated by lamplight in the jungles of Burma. His last medical innovation was completed. His work finished, his healing continued,